Well, good morning. Welcome to another video. One of the things that is often helpful to make obvious in the rising up or in the healing of your mind, and if you're feeling suicidal or depressed or anxious or whatever, then obviously the mind needs healing, because all of these things are just states of the mind, or one state of the mind, which is born out of a fear, and a fundamental and intrinsically all-pervading fear that we react to in everything, which we call life. It's a fear of life, a fear of living, a fear of being ourself, and because we are life, we're part of it, and we are the conscious observer of it, etc., etc. Right? You have to include yourself in as part of what life is. You can't be life and then you as something else who seems to be experiencing it. The experience and the experiencer are one. So, one of the things that is helpful to remember is that when you embark upon a path of healing, you obviously can't do it with the same kind of thinking that you have now, because the same kind of thinking you have now, if you look honestly at it, there's no solutions there other than to tell yourself to get to the doctor and get some mood blockers or antidepressants, etc., or maybe you need to be locked up in the nut house, or who knows what. But there's no actual tangible solutions there. There's only ideas of treating a symptom, and I hope that makes sense. Right, so depression, anxiety, and all of these things are symptoms of a cause which is hidden in unawareness in the mind, which for us shows up as this little niggly kind of splinter in the mind's eye, which plays on our lives day in, day out. And until someone brings it to your attention, like I just did, until somebody tells you that there's this kind of glitch inside you, you're not going to really know what it is. You'll be looking out there into the world going, what's wrong with the world? Why is everyone so fucked up? And why do I seem to be okay and seem to be able to keep it all together? But, I get so depressed with the world, with other people. Well, it's not the world and other people that you get depressed with. It's your own thinking about the world and your own thinking about other people. And that's going to be a big pill to swallow, because your mind will automatically go into the filing cabinet of its own thinking and try to pull out situations and events where you want to prove me wrong. And you can play that game till the sun goes down. I'm not interested in playing that game. Having played that game with myself for a long time, until finally I surrendered, and in the realization that the filing cabinet of my own thinking and the filing cabinet of my own memories didn't contain anything other than more questions, more doubts, more of the same shit that I didn't like in the world. And swallowing that bitter pill of truth that makes you realize that you're only reacting to your own thoughts, not to the world, is not always a welcome remedy. So taking responsibility then for your thoughts, because it's only at the level of thought that you can exercise choice, right? Taking responsibility for your thoughts, and therefore your choices in the willingness to learn to make a better choice, right? Based on a new perspective, or based on a new set of parameters for your choice making, is something that you have to do. And which is why I always advocate A Course in Miracles. If anyone out there's got a copy and you're reading it and whatever, you'll understand that the thought system that the Course uses, and the concepts and principles that the thought that thought system uses are incredibly different by necessity to the thought system that we tend to adopt for ourselves when we're born in the world and go through worldly education, etc. They're spiritual. Right? When I say spiritual, I don't mean beads and incense and whatever. If you're into that, that's fine. I'm not interested. But chakras and crystals and all of that other nonsense, it's like it's got nothing to do with it. But I mean spiritual as in spirit is the Latin translation of the Greek word psyche, which means to think and to remember, which is the activity of the mind, right? So they're concepts and principles in the course written and expressed through a Christian terminology and what we call a Christian terminology because that's what we're used to, but Father and Son, which is the depiction of a relationship, me with the divine, specifically because concepts like that can't be corrupted by the ego mind, by the mind that likes to play the victim card, etc. The world's such a fucked up place, So having principles and having a philosophy and a storyline to look at that is beyond the storytelling that we tell ourselves ensures that we can't corrupt it, right? Now, in the idea of God or universal mind or anything like that, we have to have faith with that. We can't see it with our eyes, smell it with our nose, touch it with our fingers, etc. And yet we're told that it's all around us, it's in us and everything else, all encompassing. But that becomes a matter of faith until it's your experience. And taking those little leaps of faith is how healing happens. Right? You don't get out of this. You don't find peace within yourself without taking a leap of faith and putting your efforts into making a connection with something that you can't see and can't touch. And I remember many, many years ago, I didn't have a Course in Miracles, but I'd met and spoken to many, many people on the path from religious avenues, from non-religious avenues, anyone from a housewife to a priest, basically, that would listen to my drama. And I got a lot of same sort of core value response from them, which led me to believe that there was something going on that I wasn't aware of. I remember thinking to myself, how can all these people be so deluded into thinking that there's a higher power or a God if they can't see it? And it wasn't until, for me anyway, I don't know where the trigger, where the penny drops for you, but it wasn't for me until I really started to equate all these same core belief expressions to Star Wars, funnily enough, and Q from Star Trek, because I had a very science fiction kind of mind, and the penny started to drop. I started to realize that God was more of a force than a person, more of a power source than a judgmental kind of authority. And I started to feel good with that idea, and I could relate on a quantum physics kind of level to the idea that there is an origin or an original source to the universe that was an all-pervading power. And obviously, because if the universe did come from a big bang, everything had to come from one thing, and that one thing therefore must still impregnate or be part of everything that is, because there wasn't two big bangs as far as we know. And I hope that makes sense. So having a thought system that you can't corrupt, that you have to leave up to faith, is how you sort of bring about the confrontations that are required when looking at the idea of healing something or some event or situation or whatever that seems to play out in your mind over and over again. Now, the one situation and event that plays out in everything over and over again is the coming to terms with truth, right? And we see, or coming to an acceptance of truth, and we see our lack of that acceptance of truth because we don't remember what truth is, God, etc. We see that played out in every situation, event, and relationship in our lives, from the day we're born to the day we're not born, which we're not really ever born. That's another story. I won't get into that right now. All you flat earthers, all your ears just suddenly. So that the idea of untruth, or the idea of this isn't quite reality, plays out in every relationship we have with people, situations, objects, whatever. And in everything, there's an emptiness. Now, if you're honest and if you pay attention, if you pay conscious attention to the relationships you have, you'll realize that they tend to operate on a kind of a superficial level. And I've had many discussions and talks with people where I've left those discussions and talks feeling kind of like flat or drained or empty, and realized later on that it was me not receiving and not giving fully of myself in that situation, where I kind of took the interaction for granted, I guess, and didn't perceive a higher purpose or a higher value to it. Right now, that takes some learning, because in every situation, event, and relationship you find yourself in, there is the opportunity for both giver and receiver to come out of that situation further ahead, spiritually speaking, than when they went in. Right? There's always an opportunity in everything to allow the drop of the defense mechanisms that the ego would have you hear through and see through, to allow a moment of faith or a moment of miraculous joining to occur in any given situation, to show you the truth of that situation. Right? We call that a holy instant or a miraculous moment. But you have to allow your mind to learn to become miracle minded. You're never in any relationship or situation or encounter for the reason you think. There's not just the superficial physical nature of things going on. And when you take that on board, you can learn to step back and be willing to hear from the other person or through the other person, who seems to be another person. It's really yourself, right? I'm meeting myself everywhere I go, to hear or to perceive where that moment of joining is, and to not fill that moment in, that blank moment in, with your conceptual blah, 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 which is why it's good to have a thought system where in your own conceptual blah, 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 you're learning that it's pointless, that it's meaningless. It only gets you into trouble and only leaves you feeling flat and empty and whatever. And you learn to stop depending on it. Right? So in every situation and event, it becomes a divine encounter rather than a physical one. It's like I'm waiting in this moment with this person, listening with my heart, listening with my mind, and waiting in a silent kind of meditative posture in my consciousness for an opening or a moment of joining to occur, which will happen if I don't block up the channel. Right? And it'll always be a happy moment. There will always be joy. There will always be that true connection. And not only on the physical level will you feel like you had an actual connection with somebody, which is what we like to think we feel when we say I fell in love with someone, I had a connection, we're connected with soulmates on the same level, woo, all of that. But just in everyday stuff, it's totally possible, and in a spiritual sense, inevitable, that you will just have these connections and find yourself falling in love with everybody if you don't block up the channel. The person at the supermarket checkout, the person that mows your lawn perhaps, whatever it is. And the other person doesn't even have to know that you're a seeker of truth or a spiritual aspirant or any of that sort of stuff. And you'll find great joy in the practice. And of course, in the practice means you're not perfect at it. So don't get depressed if you find yourself thinking that nothing happened, right? At the very least, a willingness happened, right? In you, there was a willingness there to begin to apply the letting go of your ego in a certain situation, of your judgments, defenses, etc., to allow something miraculous to happen. And of course, you're going to muck that up at first, because the habituation is to want to be listening to someone with the next thing you're going to say tucked away in your mind, ready to go. It's like having a loaded gun. And that's a common thing in the group sessions and things that we do. People always say to me, and we have these little talking, listening exercises that we do. People often say to me at the end of these exercises, man, I found it so hard to just listen. All these thoughts kept popping up in my head about something I could say, rather than leaving the moment open and just allowing that listening to become a total space of acceptance and receiving, right? Which is something really quite beautiful if you can allow that to happen. But it takes a minute. It takes mind training, which is why I always recommend A Course in Miracles, and to do those workbook lessons, right? You have to have a reference point for something, albeit taken on faith at first, but you have to have a reference point for something that you can't corrupt, because that's the nature of ego. It corrupts everything. Its purpose is to maintain the illusion of separation and not to allow you to join or to connect with someone on a holier level, on a higher level. So, and the rule of thumb there is, don't judge the form, apply the principle. Just get in here. Don't judge the form, apply the principle. It's like, don't fight or wrestle with your ego. Don't try to deny your ego, because in that you make it real. And remember, fear is an illusion, right? Fear is not truth. If God is everything and God is love, there can't be everything and then something else. So we have two ways to see, through the eyes of love or the eyes of fear. One of those ways is false, right? One of those ways is true. And learning to make better choices based on new references, albeit taken on faith at first, until you have your own experience. Learning to make better choices then is what spirituality is, right? It's an action of mind. It's a deferral. It's a refusal, if you like, to participate in that old dream of death, and an embracing or a willingness to embrace something new, right? Without having to know what that something new is. And it's not really something new. It's something very, very old. You know, we've been loved and loving and beings of love since forever. All right, I love you. Take it easy, and see you in the next one.